Okay, good morning everyone. It's nice to see all of you here at 11 o'clock in the morning, at 10:30 almost in the morning. So I'll get right into it. So the panel, this panel that's going to happen is titled Climate Change, Technology and Communities. And climate change as a phenomenon is a well-known and documented global issue. The causes are often pointed towards the increasing use of non-renewable resources, industrial production processes, and a general increase in the use of technology. Indeed, modernity as a condition is seen as one of the leading causes of climate change. The solutions offered towards mitigation are therefore placed within an anti-modern, anti-technology discourse that also romanticizes the idea of quote-unquote indigenous solutions. Therefore, we need to ask, are there possibilities of technology and the condition of modernity working with the mitigation of climate change? The idea of these quote-unquote indigenous solutions falls into the danger of freezing indigenous communities in time, seeing them as existing outside anything modern. It then invisibilizes issues with regard to gender, caste, class, and other inequalities that are an integral part of the use of technology. So, what exactly are the assumptions made when attempting to move forward in the climate change discourse, and where it becomes exclusionary and oppressive are some of the questions that we need to ask, not just about the larger discourse, but perhaps more critically about our engagements with it as well. So, to introduce the speakers, Ms. Kalpana Sharma is an independent journalist and author, and actually, may I ask you to please come sit here and introduce you. So Kalpana Sharma is an independent journalist and author, and currently consulting editor with Economic and Political Weekly. In over 4 decades as a journalist specializing in developmental and environmental issues as well as gender, she has worked with Himmat Weekly, Indian Express, The Times of India, and The Hindu, with which she was deputy editor and Mumbai bureau chief. She is the author of Rediscovering Dharavi, Stories from Asia's Largest Slum, and editor of Missing, Half the Story, Journalism as a Gender Matters. She has also co-edited with Amu Joseph, Who's News, The Media and Women's Issues, and Terror, Counter-Terror, Women Speak Out. Archana, move on to Archana Prasad. Archana Prasad did her PhD from the Center for Historical Studies in JNU in 1994 and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Science and Technology Studies in Cornell University from 94 to 96. Prior to joining the Center for Informal Sector and Labour Studies, she has been a fellow of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library and was teaching at the Center for Jawaharlal Nehru Studies and the Department of History, Jamia Millia Islamia. She specializes in research on the contemporary history of Adivasi livelihoods, labor and resistance, women and labor, environmental and labor history. Her current research is focused on the ideologies of resistance and forms of protest among Adivasi workers through the collection of their oral histories. She is involved with several grassroots and working class movements and has served on several government committees concerning women's and Adivasi issues. She has also published several books, scholarly and popular articles on a wide range of subjects related to Adivasi and women's issues. Prof. Jayaraman was trained as, move on to Professor Jayaraman. He was trained as a theoretical physicist. He obtained his PhD from the University of Madras in 1983 and subsequently worked outside India as a postdoctoral fellow in institutions abroad. From 1991 to 2006, he was at the Institute of Mathematical Sciences, Chennai. Since 2006, when he joined the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, he has worked on science policy, particularly nuclear policy, history and philosophy of science, and broader issues of science, technology, and society. Since 2008, he has been actively working on climate change and climate policy and sustainable development. He has assisted in the formulation of India's climate policy and has participated in international and domestic negotiations and discussions on climate policy. This panel today will be moderated by Professor Tejal, who is of the Climate Change and Sustainability Studies Center here at TIS. So we also tried having with us today the National Dalit Watch, which is part of the National Campaign for Dalit Human Rights, as they have worked in the area of compensation and distribution of compensation in disaster management situations. And we know that's a large part in how we understand vulnerabilities and coping with it. It's unfortunate that we could not have them here today, but the questions they raise will hopefully be discussed here too. Thank you. Oh, yes. Also a reminder, kindly put your phones on silent. Thank you.
So it's quite a comprehensive introduction that Kaveri has just given, so I don't think I need to add too much to it. I think it's important. Just a couple of words maybe to say that the debate on environmentalism and the environment versus development debate in some sense predates our understanding and interventions in climate change. And with the arrival of the agenda for doing something about climate change, and it's sort of going from simply being something that we discuss at the international level to also affecting domestic policy, some of these debates on the environment have also informed and shaped those narratives, sort of translated to our understanding of climate change. So it's important to look at all of this together, and I'm sure the panel that we have today is perfectly suited to deal with some of these issues. So without much ado, I think I will begin with the consensus has been that Jayaraman goes first, and then it's going to be followed by Archana, and then we have Archana. So just before that, so the format would be, I'll ask the speakers to present for about 15 minutes each, then we throw the floor open for questions and comments, and then the speakers can then also respond maybe for another 7 minutes or so each. Thank you.
Thank you, organizers, for this opportunity. I would have been quite content to sit in the audience and listen for a change on the subject instead of sounding off on it yet again. And I must say I resisted very hard this consensus that I go first, but you can see from the grins all around on the rest of the panel that I failed in this task. Okay, so without apology, further apologies here goes. What I'd like to do is to first draw your attention to some aspects of the context within which we have to read the suggested theme of the discussion. I'll just go on for 15 minutes. When I reach the end of the 15 minutes, I'll stop exactly where I am. So one is that in contrast to most environmental problems, climate change is a global environmental issue. It's certainly not the first, and very often this is widely forgotten. The first was the consequences of nuclear explosions. Nuclear explosions, testing in the atmosphere, led to a worldwide rise in leukemia cases. And this was what prompted the partial test ban treaty. The only real decent nuclear weapons treaty which achieved something, that was to not test in the atmosphere. It was violated by France, Germany, etc. No, sorry, France and Britain for a while, but then they also fell in line. So the partial test ban treaty banned nuclear explosions in the atmosphere. So that was the first. The other big one, and which is somehow slipped under the radar, unfortunately, and has now become very fragmented and not seen as a comprehensive issue, is the law of the sea. So the law of the sea was the big global environmental issue that came on the agenda. It was the product of, there were intense negotiations. In fact, if you look at the history of the negotiations around the law of the sea, you also see many of the fault lines of the debate over climate being presaged there. They have already appeared. In fact, it is remarkable how, how much they echoed very early on the climate change debate. And much of the, both the challenge of dealing with climate change and the global and local, regional, local politics of climate change are all presaged in the law of the sea debate. But I think there is something uniquely special, unique about the climate change issue, in that we are not dealing with pollution. Unfortunately, given the background of the manner in which, following from the 72 Stockholm Conference, where on environment, where the first mention in an international forum of the threat of climate change was made, and due to the increasing emission of carbon dioxide. From that on through sustainable development, etc., etc. So because of that logic with which we arrived at globally the climate treaty, climate is regarded, the carbon dioxide is regarded as a pollutant. And the sort of emphasis on this is the leaning towards this is very clear in the UNFCCC. Regrettably, that is, scientifically somewhat off the target. Because carbon dioxide has also been purely natural terms. Without the Earth's protective blanket of carbon dioxide, we will be Mars. And and there will be no we, because there will be no life on Earth to talk about it. Or an excess of carbon dioxide will give us Venus, and again there is no we, because we won't be around to talk about it. So the balance of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is not how the Earth was born, as a product of the evolution of the geosphere. The balance of carbon dioxide is essential to life. So, and having said that, obviously life proceeded, and the development of the productive capacities of society had their own logic, where the atmosphere, local pollution, I am sure historically was recognized very early, the loss of grasslands, nomadic movement because of the loss of pasture, the whole technique of shifting cultivation, Sweden agriculture. So the awareness of the environment was always there, but it required the advances of the sciences of the 18th, 19th, 20th century to make us aware of the Earth as a global sort of system. In fact, any serious idea, apart from myth, of the development of the Earth's continents itself dates only a few decades before Darwin, and so we are not too far away from when we first began to understand the Earth. So that is one part of the context. But then, of course, there is a very serious challenge. The serious challenge is that the entire development of productive capacities, whether it was wood in an early period, whether it was the domestication of animals and animal power in an early period, and whether it was the use of fossil fuels subsequently, every stage that we have used energy in any form has to do very much with the release of greenhouse gases. Cows don't breathe out oxygen. Cows breathe out methane. Just to remind you, these things you don't know. So that's a very ancient phenomenon. So the poor cow was responsible, unknown to itself, every time it munched its way through its feed, that it was warming the atmosphere. Every time we cut down trees for agriculture, whether we are talking about the time of the Buddha, we were contributing to greenhouse gases, but much in a very limited way, but only in modern times have we managed to do it. But what is the problem about it? The problem is, I think it is not, as many unfortunately believe, a problem of technology alone. The relationship between human beings and human society and nature is not that we confront nature as individual entities, individual beings. The fact is that humans interact with nature as society, number one, and two, in the manner in which productive activity is organized in society. So when I say productive activities are organized, it is obvious that it is not clearly only a matter of technology, but it is also the way, let me say without apology, the relations of production are organized. So it is not simply whether you need public transport or automobiles. It is not simply a matter of whether you will fly or whether you will take a ship. It is not simply a matter of whether you will cycle, whether you will take the bus, whatever it is you do. It's not simply a matter of thermal power or solar power. All of these take place within a social and economic order. And this social and economic order is, I think I would use the term capitalism. And I have a slight problem with this term modernity, so let me put that on the table. Capitalism I don't consider modern. Ever since 1970, modernity is constituted by the I feel. Modernity is the attempt to transcend capitalism. So for me, modernity is socialism. However it is you want to understand socialism, none of us are expert at it, very of us. There have been many experiments around the world. So when I say modernity, for me modernity is socialism. Capitalism is a moribund system. I am a firm Leninist in that. So the question is of the current social and economic order, capitalism, that defines the way that we organize productive capacities and technology, and the context in which technology is used, developed, applied, or executed, implemented, all of it. Now, there is always, this has been a question of some debate. If there are other viewpoints, it will certainly come up in the discussion, I think. But when you get to this point, you realize that if you should look at the global negotiations and its impact on domestic climate action in various countries in a somewhat different way. And we need not go back into the prehistory of it. Let me start from just the Paris Agreement. So this Paris Agreement, was a very interesting agreement. It drew universal agreement. Now when you have universal agreement in a sharply divided world, your antenna should be up with suspicion. How come they all agree? They differ on everything else. As in the Bible, the wolf shall lie with the lambs and so on. It is how success. So then, and then you realize that, there are certain voices that are missing in the debate. So, for instance, the scientists didn't determine the agenda of the Paris Agreement. In fact, the scientists were excluded rather deliberately, as a new French political scientist brings out elegantly. So what was it that happened? So why is it that we have an agreement that overturns all that one has been trying all these years, and yet everybody welcomed it? And John Kerry made it clear in the year after, Paris, and that was supposed to be Obama's triumphant exit from the international stage, having left behind a legacy. Unfortunately, Trump won. So that party got ruined rather badly. Trump reigned on it. And so, but Kerry came and Kerry said, look, we all knew that the agreement was inadequate. All we wanted to do was to send a signal to business, and he didn't say capital. So we can send a signal to capital all over the world that, we think the climate problem should really be solved by markets, by enterprises, capitalist firms and entities developing technology and deploying them, support, finance, whatever it is that you want to do with the social and economic order, we will do within a framework that remains safe for capitalism. That is basically what we wanted. And so now, since then, what has been happening at an increasing pace, at I would say a disturbingly accelerating pace, is that we have the increasing attempt to privatize climate action. And so the thrust here is solving climate action through corporates, through their, whatever it is they dream up as the way to do it, doing it all in a manner, so green economy, green technology, all of it is, how can you make profits out of renewables? So whether renewables are important is not the first question. The first question, what is the preservation of profit accumulation, all that defines capitalism, while making sure that the conditions of production do not reach the point where they undermine the physical existence of capitalism itself. So you see an extraordinary thrust. So now suddenly, Bloomberg rolls up in Bonn, as we saw in November, and Bloomberg says, Jerry Brown, Bloomberg said in fact, the US government is not giving money. Oh, very good, I give you the money that the US was going to give. Who's he? So they wanted a group of activists, and they wore a halo around their heads and said, we are going to ensure climate action is done. Now look, you should take our private individual commitments as equivalent to the commitments that the United States as a nation state has undertaken within the UNFCCC under the Paris Agreement. So suppose tomorrow they walk away from it, who is responsible? So this whole drive, and you see Trump again now saying, it's not that I'm going to walk out of climate, it is just that I want a better deal. I think the old deal was not good enough. So I think this is the context in which climate action is being framed. And this constitutes, I believe, the most serious danger. And therefore the exclusionary prospects, the prospects of oppressive terms of engagement, the prospects of the lack of social justice and equity in solving the climate crisis can all be, I think, eventually traced to this as the core issue. So I think that is the larger context, and I think that in very important ways also defines our, the issues before us at the domestic level and the regional level in dealing with clients. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
First, let me thank the organizers for inviting me here. Let me also preface my remarks by saying that my main work has not been on climate change, but I've been a watcher of the debate because my main work has been on natural resources, natural resource policy management, and its impact on the division of labor. So I've been a watcher of the climate change debate, and suddenly I found that perhaps it's time to intervene in this debate and sort of take up some of the questions that Tejal and Jayaraman posed. Now, in my remarks, I think I'll divide them into 3 parts and within 15 minutes try to make some assertions, since I can't provide all the evidence over here, which I can provide during the discussion. And therefore I thank you for the opportunity, and this is the first time I'm actually giving a public lecture which includes climate change. Now, you see, the question was posed that the environment and development debate is not new. What does climate change have to do with it? Let me put it another way. I think the climate change discourse is a symptom of the current state of the environment and development debate. And it is a symptom of the climate and development debate because if you look at the well-acknowledged and popular perception drivers of climate change, deforestation, land use change and fossil fuel use. All these 3 major drivers have a direct impact on the lives of the people, especially of the working classes. So, in that sense, just as climate change is a global issue, capitalism and dealing with capitalist crisis is also a global issue. And the 2 have to be seen in dialectical relationship with each other. That's the first point that I want to make. What do I mean when I say that? For example, deforestation, conversion of lands into agriculture, and more obviously now in India into big industry, creates or releases a reserve, a labor reserve, and therefore depresses the wages of the laboring force, and therefore it has some obvious impact. Now, the same thing land use change does. The same thing, mining and all this, these are all well-known facts. I don't want to labor upon it. But I just want to say that climate change discourse within the framework of capitalism is going to affirm capitalism. Why? Because if you look at the environment and development debate today, it's basically on the value of nature, value and market. And within a neoliberal political economic framework, value is more often than not considered as exchange value. So what you have is contingent valuation, you have the T methodology, you have all these things which basically say that if you value nature, then it will automatically become a conserving exercise. It will automatically become a conserving exercise. Now it is here that I want to bring in what I'm most familiar with, the debate on forests. And that also basically impacts a lot on Adivasi Dalits and various other sections of society. You see, in 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol first came, it basically said that the southern countries should preserve their forests and they should be compensated for it in terms of greening. But by 2008, which is the most recent crisis of capitalism and the ongoing crisis of capitalism, you said not only that, you said there should be a marketization of carbon credits, you should basically have an increase in carbon stocks, and there should be multi-state investors. In that, one of the investors or one of the stakeholders, so to say, in terms of, this multilateral policy language, which I don't like, but I'm using it for want of a better word in order to sing it. One of the sort of stakeholders were meant to be the so-called communities, because the communities were meant to be at a comparative advantage because they lived close to nature. I mean, this is the way in which the neoliberal framework, not only the economics framework, but the entire neoliberal, neoclassical framework looks at the whole question. And therefore, it starts with basically saying that if you increase the stocks in one area, you can trade it to pollute in another area. Basically, this is what the climate change debate is. The polluter pays principle, which is what your country has as the basis of its environmental policy today. The 2006 environmental policy is basically about the polluter pays principle. Now, this polluter pays principle doesn't recognize one thing, because they are not Marxists, they won't recognize it. That nature has a use value which cannot be exchanged after a certain point in time. Now, this is not to romanticize nature, but that is to say that when you talk of the regeneration of nature, it has to take into account something that cannot be replaced. Or if it is to be replaced, it has to be replaced by something which produces the same type of value to preserve the balance. So now, if we look at this problem, we have what is in 2008, what do you have? You have basically an enhanced financialization of nature taking place. And with this enhanced financialization of nature, you have basically the flows right from the international level till the community level. Now, if you track these flows, what is it that you find? Who gains and who loses? What type of development are we promoting? Who gains and who loses? If you look at Latin American countries, why I'm emphasizing this is because, India is still at the initial stage of implementing its RED policy. But it has lessons from other countries to learn. If you look at most of the African countries where investments are taking place, or Latin American countries where most of the investments are taking place through the Amazon fund, you find that the biggest beneficiaries of the funding are who? They are the governments who are now getting out of money, so they are using this whole policy to basically build up their institutional infrastructure and compensate for their salaries and all through all this. This is what happened with the forestry program in India also. Yeah. Secondly, there are the multilateral organizations and donor governments. In most of the 13-14 countries that we are tracking, actually donor governments are some of the biggest beneficiaries of the financial flows. And who do these donor governments have a link with? They have a link with international NGOs and national NGOs and consultancies. Now, then you have private foundations like Microsoft Foundation, Walt Disney Foundation and others. And let me tell you, by the way, Walt Disney Foundation is one of the biggest carbon traders of this world today. It's one of the biggest carbon traders of this world. So what do? They basically create the credits and then they market them for a profit. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the terms of the debate are such that they are creating new forms of property. And these new forms of property are being created because capitalism was in a crisis and it needed to rework itself or reincarnate itself in order to this thing. So carbon credits became a new form of capital trading exercise, and in this carbon credit thing, the rights over the carbon belong to the project developer. If the rights over the carbon credit belong to the rights of the project developer, who are the main developers? They are foreign consultancies, international academia, international NGOs, and national NGOs. If you look at the percentage of fund flow to even the so-called community-based organizations, which are largely national NGOs, it is basically 0.5% to 2% of the entire funding. Now, if you look at the market side of it, what is happening? There are only two types of players in carbon trading market. One are private players, and the second are public-private partnerships. And out of the in the forest credit, carbon credits, out of say about 255 deals that I have looked at least, more than 80% are private corporations. More than 80% are private corporations. If that is the case, then whose interest is the carbon market serving, and is it actually meeting the need for so-called conservation or whatever why am I calling it so-called? Because on the one hand, you have this elaborate arrangement, supranational arrangement that is being worked out, but in terms of domestic policy, you basically have the opposite happening. Almost every African nation is competing with modified land laws. That's happened in India also, by the way now. So every state is competing with each other, every sub-region is competing with each other, with modified land laws, liberalized mining laws. So what does this mean? What is the entire system of forest carbon conservation, the so-called conservation, serving? The simple point that I am trying to make is that obviously if you want to control the temperature of the earth, then you have to control the players who control the natural resources. And if you don't do that, then you are at a dead end basically. So, but that is not going to happen under a capitalist system. In other words, the point that I am trying to make is that the red class forest carbon trading system is basically a method of preserving capitalism in its worst crisis. In its worst crisis. And the argument of certain people that it provides a space for indigenous, so-called indigenous practices and all this, it's hard to find evidence for them. Anyway, indigenous practices may not be the greatest adaptation strategy for climate change also. That's a different matter, that's a different debate which I'm not getting into right now. But the solution to that can only lie outside this system when you conceive of a different type of a value of nature. The question is that for us is how do we conceive that value under socialist, I mean, for want of a better word, socialist modernity, so to say, rather than a capitalist modernity. Because a capitalist modernity is, what is it doing? It's basically unleashing forces in the name of climate change or amelioration of climate change and burgeoning the labor reserve. It's burgeoning the labor reserve. Whereas In a socialist modernity, we don't want that, which means that your technology choices, your things have to be different. And this is a matter that I would like to actually open up for debate also. What kind of a strategy can we conceive of outside the system of the financialization of labor, which is not based on a romantic ideology of environmentalism, which is not based on a romantic ideology of environmentalism, because I've spent more than half my life arguing against that romantic variety of environmentalism. So I don't want to go back to that, but I think that another reality is possible. But it is only possible if your domestic policy is focused on the redistribution of wealth rather than on the concentration of wealth. And my fear is that the forest carbon credit system basically leads to more concentration of wealth rather than the redistribution of wealth that we stop.
Okay, so let me also preface what I'm saying by saying that I am the generalist here among specialists. If you look at your program, you will see I'm the only non-doctor on this program, on this panel. But I'm glad that Jayaraman is the exception on this panel, which otherwise is usually the other way around. 3 men and 1 woman. Yeah, so it's interesting what Jayaraman and Archana have said. So you talked about the romantic idea of environmentalism. So let me talk about the unromantic idea of looking at things from the feminist lens. My journalism has been based on looking at issues. I'm a journalist, so I'm therefore a generalist. I'm not an expert on climate change, but I have tried to understand it and put my head around it. And essentially, as a journalist, I have argued that all these issues, if you filter them through the gender lens, you get a very different perspective, whether it is environmental issues, climate change, developmental issues, other policies, etc., which is what I have tried to address. And from what I've read on the climate change debate, it seems to me that's one thing that is really missing, or it is there as a add-on, and Vibhuti knows this because one has argued for a long time that the feminist perspective should not be an add-in and stir as part of the developmental debate. And similarly, I think in the climate change debate, it ought to be central for the very reason that feminist economists and others have argued for a long time, that if you look at these issues from the perspective of how it impacts the people who are the most vulnerable, that often happens to be poor women, then you see the impacts of these policies in a very different way, and perhaps not even in such a technical way. Maybe there are actually very simple solutions that can be done to address it. So it seems, at least from what my reading is on this issue of climate change, and I've often gone to meetings about it, I have not found enough articulation on this perspective, and I think it is an area that requires much greater research. And I'll tell you this, even from my experience as a journalist, we put together this book called Missing Half the Story, Journalism as if Gender Matters. And in that, I really looked very hard to find if there was even one article that looked at climate change and how it impacted poor women. And with difficulty I found one, and I really did a full search for it. This was in 2010, and I don't think the situation has changed much. And the reason why, one goes over this over and over again and has to remind people that there is something like gender that ought to inform us in the manner in which I understand climate change, is precisely because it ain't there a lot of the time. Again, speaking for myself as a journalist, within journalism, many of us have argued as much as we can, and I've been a journalist for 45 years, that you're a better journalist if you actually can wear a gender lens. It's not that you're a different you're not a gender specialist within journalism. You become a better journalist if you have if you understand how our society mediates itself through gender, through caste and class, those are like essential tools that we ought to have as journalists. But you'll be surprised, of course, how the majority of journalists don't even think about it. You know, it's like a brand new idea. Really, we need to understand about gender. So, for people like yourselves, I'm sure this is an obvious thing that you have, I presume, thought about it, or is that a wrong presumption? Somebody speak up and tell me. Yeah. Okay, so then let's take just one or two different things. I mean, Archana, you talked about land use. Now, and there's been much talk about agriculture, for instance, and the impact of changing climatic patterns on agriculture. But, you know, you read the literature and know that very little, especially even in India, acknowledges how many women are involved in this, and how the adverse impact of that is very directly on the women, not just in terms of income and agricultural income, but the kind of workload that it increases, specifically on poor women. And surely that is an area that ought to be documented so that whatever policies are made address this specifically and not in a kind of a general way about the farmer or agriculture, but specifically how it impacts women. The same can be said for forestry, the same can be said for fisheries. And a lot of these areas that have come into the discussion as part of the larger aspect of the impact of climate change, and I'm talking only about India, but I believe there has been similar discussions about Africa and other parts of the world. I think generally one realizes also that even in the policy making and discussions on these issues, there are not enough people, and I won't say women because I think it's men and women, who have incorporated this perspective and who bring it to inform policy. So, of course, it often happens that they're actually men, but I don't think necessarily adding a few women to those policy discussions makes a difference unless they bring with them that perspective. And I think that perspective is very much missing because you don't see it in the outcomes. You know, and the other thing about, I mean, I'm not going into the technical aspects of how climate change, I mean, these are things that the experts will talk about. But I'm talking about this issue of how we view it. It's interesting how the media and generalists usually look at climate change only from changing weather patterns, for instance, and pollution, as you mentioned. But changing weather patterns has become increasingly the focus of the writing, and from that, people have tried to explain how aspects of climate change have actually led to this changing of weather patterns. So whether it's cyclones or hurricanes or flooding. What is not done is then thereafter what happens. You know, whether these can be scientifically linked or not is one aspect of it that is sometimes discussed. What is not discussed is the impact and thereafter. So, for instance, in terms of flooding and large natural disasters, there has been some writing and work that was done, especially after the tsunami, on how women were actually more impacted than men, very specifically. In the case of the tsunami, both by the actual disaster and thereafter in the kind of rehab and resettlement policies that were in place, which did not incorporate this aspect into the planning. And in fact, recently the London School of Economics has come out with a study, in 2006 it came out, a study of 141 natural disasters, and it found that, that when these included the Asian tsunami, Hurricane Mitch, Hurricane Katrina, and other storms in America, and European heat waves and cyclones. And they found that when women do not enjoy economic and social rights equal to men, more women than men die in disasters. And that's an obvious statement, but it's so obvious that it's overlooked. You know, it's not taken into account. So my suggestion is, especially for those who are working in these areas, that I think the time has come now to really put aside very specific time and effort into documenting this, because unless there is enough data and enough studies that actually link the outcomes of climate change through a gender lens, I don't think it will inform policy enough and make a difference. And I think it is in places like this that this ought to be one aspect, one focus that could be taken up. And as I said, perhaps it is already being taken up. Forgive me if I'm ignorant about it. But I do try and read as much as I can of these things as they come out of these studies, and I found that there really is not all that much that is coming out. The other thing I want to take up is this, something that both Jayaraman touched upon, which I hold responsible actually for the fact that within India we're not doing enough of this kind of focused research and writing, whether it's the impact on the poor or on marginalized communities or on women in the context of climate change, is because much of the agenda seems to be, we discussed it earlier, agenda setting seems to be done outside India. And so I'll give you an example. In health reporting, for instance, in India, much of health reporting in the initial years in the 70s and all, whatever it was, would be about, communicable diseases and their impact. Then HIV came into the picture. And because of HIV, there was funding, including funding for journalists to go and do stories on HIV. So suddenly all these other diseases and problems, especially those that affect the poorest, disappeared from our newspaper pages, and there were lots of stories. Good stories on HIV. I'm not saying that they are not to be dissed or should not be regarded, but it was as if the health agenda got steered that way. And thereafter, it got steered to lifestyle diseases. As the media became more and more corporatized, and therefore, I worked with a particular paper where we were literally told that we have to do news that suits our readers, and our readers were middle and upper class readers, so we don't need to talk about poverty and the diseases of the poor. So health reporting literally became reporting on lifestyle diseases. So there's a tendency sometimes, and I'm speaking very much as a journalist and not as an academic, there is a tendency also in the climate issue of it being focused on certain aspects and perhaps those that remain hidden anyway from research, from writing, which is the impact on the poorest and the most marginalized, get addressed, but get addressed also in a very marginal way, and do not become actually what I would argue in a country like India ought to be the central focus of discussions. You can certainly have the technical discussions, but when we're talking about people, because it's people who are affected by climate change, those people surely ought to be the poorest and the most marginalized who ought to form the center of that kind of research. So I'll leave that for you to think about and talk about, because as I said, if I'm uninformed, you'll have to forgive me, but from my own reading and understanding so far and what I have seen on issues around climate change, I find that this is a big hole that has somehow not been addressed adequately.
Thank you, and we'd like to thank all speakers for staying well within their time. Please, I think, throw the floor open for questions now and use my prerogative as a moderator to ask the first one. So I generally maybe ask all three of you to talk a little bit about addressing some of the, I think Archana sort of referred to it in passing, as to a new strategy that does not, on the one hand, romanticize the environment and environmental questions, and on the other side, also does not uncritically accept solutions that are constructed and proposed within a system which is unequal. So, capitalism, for example, solutions of capitalism. So you have that, and just to sort of comment a little bit on what Kalpana said. So this time in the COP at Bonn, there was a gender day, officially. It didn't really, it was called a gender day, and there was there were a lot of programs organized on gender, and there was a special mention in the adaptation, the resolution, draft resolution about, there was a bracket which it said that specifically take into consideration issues of indigenous communities and women. And the bracket typically means that it's not really officially a part of the, but then Saudi Arabia this time argued to remove the brackets, and it was universally accepted. So these issues, but mostly, of course, understood as add-ons, not necessarily central to the debate. And in some ways, if you look at the way in which they are addressed, also by people who organize panels on some of these issues, there is a tendency to romanticize and tendency by also the West and NGOs of the West who have the money to hold such panels in Bonn and invite people for them to romanticize the poverty and inequality of the global South